It was one of those mornings at Buckingham Palace where everything looked perfect on the outside. The sky was pale blue, almost too polished, like someone had ironed it overnight. The flowers along the east garden were freshly cut. The guards stood at their posts like men carved from stone, still, silent, watching everything and showing nothing. Inside the palace walls, the world moved differently from the world outside. Every conversation had a layer underneath it. Every smile carried weight. Every entrance was an event, whether anyone admitted it or not. Prince George was 11 years old that morning, and he moved through the palace the way children do when they have grown up inside something enormous, not intimidated by it, but not quite fully belonging to it either. He had his father's steadiness and his mother Catherine's warmth, but there was also something uniquely his own beginning to emerge. A quiet confidence. An awareness. He understood, even at 11, that the world watched him differently from other boys. He had learned not to shrink from it, but also not to perform for it. He simply existed within it, which was perhaps the hardest thing of all. That morning he had come down from his private rooms to meet his grandmother, Queen Camilla, for what had been scheduled as a brief family engagement before a more formal afternoon event. These moments were meant to be easy. Low stakes. The kind of ordinary family time that palaces try hard to manufacture and never quite succeed at making feel natural. Still, the effort was made. Staff had prepared a sitting room on the second floor, comfortable but tasteful, with soft light coming through long curtains and a tea service arranged on a low table. Camilla arrived first, which was unusual. She was typically escorted in with careful coordination, but that morning she had come slightly ahead of schedule, moving through the corridor with two of her personal staff and her protection officer walking close behind. She looked, by all accounts, composed. She was always composed. Even in her most private moments inside the palace, Camilla carried herself with the particular discipline of someone who had learned, over decades, that composure was armor. The world had not always been kind to her. The British public had not always been kind to her. She had worn that composure through things that would have flattened most people, and she wore it still. What nobody in the room was fully prepared for was Tom Parker Bowles. Camilla's son from her first marriage was not a man who existed comfortably inside palace protocol. He was 50 years old, charming in the way that men who've been charming their whole lives become charming, reflexively, automatically, sometimes without even meaning to. He was a food writer, a public figure in his own right, someone who occupied a strange dual identity as both royally adjacent and thoroughly civilian. He moved in Camilla's world but was not fully of it. He had opinions. He expressed them. He laughed loudly at the wrong moments. He occupied space in a way that palace corridors were not really designed for. He had been invited that morning through a chain of loosely coordinated calendar decisions that, in hindsight, several members of the household staff would quietly describe as an oversight. Not wrong, exactly. Just not carefully thought through. Tom had been visiting his mother for a private lunch that was supposed to conclude before the family engagement began. It had not concluded. And so Tom Parker Bowles found himself drifting into the sitting room just as Prince George was arriving from the other end of the corridor. They saw each other across the room. Tom smiled. George offered the careful, measured nod of a child who has been trained since birth to greet adults with poise. There was nothing alarming in that first moment. Nothing that would have made any of the staff tense. Tom crossed the room, relaxed and easy, the way he always moved, and that was when it happened. He lunged. Not violently. Not with any intent that anyone in the room would later describe as threatening. But he moved fast, and he moved toward the boy, arms opening in the gesture of someone who intended a warm, affectionate greeting, a hug, possibly, or one of those enthusiastic two-handed handshakes that big, loud, friendly men deploy without thinking. The movement was quick. It was sudden. It crossed the space between them in a way that, to any trained eye in that room, read as a breach. The protection officer moved before anyone's brain had finished processing what was happening. He was positioned near the door, which put him at an angle to both Tom and George. He did not shout. He did not tackle anyone. What he did was step sharply, precisely, into the line between Tom's trajectory and the prince. One fluid insertion, the kind of movement that looks almost casual until you understand what it prevented. His hand came up, palm out, and Tom stopped. Not because he'd been physically restrained. Because the gesture, the position, the absolute clarity of the officer's intent, all of it landed in an instant. Tom blinked. Stepped back. The smile didn't leave his face, but something flickered behind it. The room held its breath. Camilla, seated near the window, had turned at the movement. She looked at her son, then at the officer, then at George. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way. But those who knew her well enough to read the small things, the slight tightening at the corner of her mouth, the way her hand moved half an inch toward the arm of her chair, understood that she had absorbed what happened and was already processing it with the careful, controlled machinery that ran underneath her composure. George had not flinched. That was the thing that struck the room after the fact, when people began to quietly talk about what they had witnessed. The boy had not flinched, had not stepped back, had not shown alarm. He had simply stood still, watching, as the situation resolved itself around him. It was either remarkable self-possession for an 11-year-old, or it was the result of a childhood spent being trained, gently but consistently, to read rooms and not react to them publicly. Maybe both. Probably both. Tom Parker Bowles said something then. A joke, from the tone of it, an attempt to dissolve the tension with humor, which was his instinct in most uncomfortable situations. The officer did not smile. Camilla produced a sound that might charitably have been called a laugh. A member of the household staff near the door found something important to look at on the floor. What happened next in that room would be discussed in pieces, in fragments, in the careful language of people who work in places where discretion is the first professional requirement. But the moment itself, the lunge, the step, the held breath, the boy standing still, had already happened. It was already real. And it would ripple outward from that sitting room in ways that nobody in it could have predicted that morning, under the too-perfect sky, with the freshly cut flowers and the stone-still guards and the world outside that never knew what the world inside looked like. The palace had been stunned. Not loudly. Not dramatically. In the way that palaces are stunned, quietly, thoroughly, and with the understanding that nothing that happened inside those walls was ever as simple as it appeared from the outside. The protection officer returned to his position. Tom Parker Bowles accepted a cup of tea. Camilla resumed the posture of a woman who had not just watched her son be stopped from crossing a line he had not known was there. And Prince George sat down, folded his hands in his lap, and looked out the window at the garden below. His face was calm. His eyes were working. He was 11 years old and he already understood that the most important things in rooms like this were always the things that nobody said out loud. The morning continued. The tea was poured. And somewhere inside the machinery of the palace, inside the reports that would be filed and the conversations that would be had behind closed doors and the quiet, permanent record that institutions like this one keep of everything, the moment was noted, processed, and stored. Not forgotten. Never forgotten. Just held, the way the palace held everything, with perfect, airless stillness. Outside, London went on being London. Tourists photographed the gates. Traffic moved along the mall. Nobody knew what had just happened 40 feet above their heads and behind 12 inches of palace wall. That was how it always worked. The outside world saw the ceremony, the processions, the balcony waves, the curated image of a family that existed at a level of formality most people could only press their faces against from a distance. The inside world was something else entirely. Warmer and colder at the same time. More human, and somehow more fragile for it. A place where an unthinking lunge across a sitting room could make a trained protection officer move like water and could make a queen's hand travel half an inch toward a chair arm and could make a boy of 11 look out a window with eyes that were doing far more work than his face was showing. Something had shifted. The question was what, exactly, and how far the shift would travel before it settled. Nobody in that room could have told you yet. But everyone in it knew, in the particular way that people who live inside institutions know things, bone deep, wordless, certain that the morning had changed. That what came after it would not be exactly the same as what had come before. That the guard's quick action, that single fluid step, had done more than stop a man mid-stride. It had drawn a line. Visible now to everyone in the room who had not seen it before. The palace sat still around all of them. Heavy, old, watching. The way it always did. The way it always had. The way everyone in that room understood without discussing it, it always would be why the afternoon the palace had returned to its official face. The family engagement scheduled for later in the day proceeded as planned: formal photographs, a brief outdoor appearance, the choreography of public royalty performed with the smoothness that decades of practice produces. Prince George stood where he was supposed to stand. He smiled when the moment called for a smile. He shook hands, nodded, moved from one position to the next with the kind of composed awareness that made photographers on the other side of the barriers nod with quiet approval. He looked, to anyone watching from outside, like a boy doing very well at a demanding and unusual life. Inside the palace that evening, the conversation had begun. Not a loud conversation. Not a confrontational one. The palace did not do confrontation loudly, it processed things through layers, through the quiet movement of information from one careful pair of hands to the next, through the coded language of official correspondence and unofficial murmurs in corridors, and the particular British art of saying something extremely serious in a tone of utter reasonableness. But the conversation was happening. The protection officer had filed his report within the hour. 2 senior members of the household had been briefed. A note had been placed in the polished, economical language of these things into the record of the day's events. Tom Parker Bowles had, by then, left the palace. He had departed mid-afternoon, driven away in a car that made no particular impression on the staff at the gate. He had said his goodbyes to his mother with the ease of a man who had not fully understood the gravity of what the morning had produced. Perhaps he genuinely didn't. Perhaps in his mind it had resolved itself the moment the officer stepped back and the tea was poured and the conversation moved to other things. That was the thing about people who existed at the edges of institutional power rather than inside it: they could leave. They could walk out through the gate and re-enter the world where palace protocol was something you read about in newspapers, not something that was quietly, permanently embedded in the architecture of every room. Camilla could not leave. She was the palace now, as much as anyone was. And she knew, sitting in her private rooms that evening, that the morning had created something that would require her attention in ways that were both personal and political, in the particular, inseparable way that everything in a royal family is both personal and political simultaneously. She had not spoken to her son about it before he left. There had not been a natural moment, and Camilla was not a woman who forced moments. She had learned, through a life lived largely in the public gaze, that things handled clumsily tend to bruise more than things handled with patience. She would speak to Tom. She would find the right time and the right words, which was to say, she would find words that were direct enough to be understood and gentle enough not to damage the relationship she had with a son she loved fiercely and sometimes found enormously complicated. But first she had to navigate something more immediate. William had been told. It had not been a dramatic telling. Nobody sat the Prince of Wales down and recounted the morning's events with alarm or embellishment. It had come through the proper channels, in the proper language, as these things did. A brief, factual summary. The relevant parties. The action taken. The resolution. But William was not a man who received information about his son's security and processed it with detachment. He was a father. He was a father who had watched his mother die in ways that were entangled with the pressures of being royal, and who had made it the organizing principle of his parenting that his children would be protected, not just physically, but from the particular grinding weight that public life could put on a child. He read the report. He asked 2 questions. Then, he was quiet for a while in the way that men who are trained not to show things are quiet, not peacefully, but with a stillness that has effort underneath it. Catherine read it too, later that evening. She asked different questions, more specific, more focused on George, on how he had appeared in the moment, on whether anyone had spoken to him afterward. The answer to the last question was, not formally. George had gone through the rest of the day without any direct acknowledgement of the morning's incident from the adults around him. This was partly protocol. You did not create drama by narrating an event that the child in question had already navigated without visible distress. But Catherine's questions suggested she thought this deserved more than protocol. She was right. She usually was about George. The boy himself had come through the afternoon events with his usual steadiness, but those who knew him well enough, his private secretary, the tutor who had accompanied him that day, one of his personal protection officers, noticed small things. He had been quieter than usual between engagements. Not withdrawn, not troubled, just more interior. He had asked, at one point during a brief break, a question that nobody had quite known how to answer. He had asked why the man this morning had been stopped. He had not asked it with fear. He had asked it with the tone of someone taking inventory, understanding the mechanics of something he had witnessed. He was building a map, the way intelligent children build maps of the worlds they inhabit, so that the unexpected becomes comprehensible and the comprehensible becomes navigable. His protection officer at that moment, a different officer from the morning, had given him an answer that was honest without being more than he needed. He had explained that the officer's job was to make sure that everyone in a room with the prince moved in ways that were expected and safe. That when movement was unexpected, the officer responded to it. That it was not about the person being dangerous. It was about certainty. About knowing, at all times, exactly what was happening in his space. George had listened. Nodded slowly. Then, he had said, quietly, that the man had just been trying to say hello. Yes, the officer had agreed. He had. George had thought about this for a moment. Then, he had moved on to the next thing, the way children do when they have processed something to their own satisfaction, closed the folder on it, and returned to the surface of their day. But, the officer had noted it. Had written it down later, in the private way that people who spend their professional lives protecting children write down the things that children say, not for any official record, but because the things children say when they are quietly processing the world tell you who they are becoming. Back in Camilla's private rooms, the Queen was doing what she did when she needed to think without being watched. She was reading. Not something important. Something light. She had always read light things when the serious things needed space to arrange themselves in her mind without interference. She turned pages without fully taking in the words. The evening had gone quiet around her. Her personal staff had withdrawn. Her protection officers sat outside the door. She was thinking about her son, and about what it meant that he had created a situation inside these walls that had required intervention. Not because she thought Tom was dangerous, she knew her son completely, and dangerous was nowhere in the description. But because she understood something that Tom, living outside the institution, might not fully grasp. Inside the palace, inside this family, the rules were not ceremonial. They were functional. They existed because the alternative, the world without those rules, without the constant invisible scaffolding of protocol and protection, was something this family had experienced. Had experienced at the worst possible level. Had lost people to. The rules existed because royalty was a condition that attracted, in its orbit, not only warmth and goodwill but also the full range of human intention, obsession, resentment, entitlement, and, occasionally something darker. The protection officers existed not to perform security but to provide it, quietly, constantly, without drama, until the one moment when drama was required. And, in that one moment, they moved. The way the officer had moved that morning. That was not something to be frustrated by. That was something to be grateful for, especially when, the thing being intercepted was harmless. Because the interception was not about harm. It was about certainty. About the non-negotiable maintenance of a zone of predictability around the people inside it. Camilla understood this. She had lived inside it long enough to understand it the way you understand gravity, not as a rule someone imposed, but as a condition of the place you existed. The question was how to help Tom understand it without making him feel like a threat, which he was not, or like a stranger, which she refused to let him become. Her children from her first marriage had navigated a complicated relationship with her royal life from the beginning. They were hers, completely, unconditionally. But they were not the institution's. And the institution had its own logic that did not yield to family feeling. She set her book down. Reached for her phone. Did not dial. Not yet. Outside, London had gone dark. The palace gates glowed under floodlights. The guards changed. The tourists had long since dispersed. The city moved through its nighttime rhythms, completely unaware that inside the old stone building its inhabitants were sitting with the shape of a morning that had lasted only minutes but would take considerably longer to fully digest. 3 floors up and 2 wings away from where Camilla sat, George was asleep. Or at least his lights were off and his door was closed, and no one had reason to check beyond that. He was a child, and children close their doors and the world hopefully lets them sleep. Whether he was actually sleeping or lying awake doing more of that quiet interior inventory, building more of his map of this enormous, strange, privileged, demanding world he had been born into, nobody knew. What was known was that tomorrow would come, and the palace would compose itself again for it, and whatever arrangements needed to be made quietly between people who understood the situation would be made quietly between them. The officer's report would sit in the record. William would process what he was processing. Camilla would find the right moment to call her son. Catherine would check on George in the way that mothers check on children, not obviously, not with the conversation they're actually having, but in the small attentive ways that children feel and adults hope are sufficient. And George would wake up, and eat breakfast, and go about the business of being the future king, one careful, watchful day at a time. The morning had been a small thing and a large thing simultaneously, the way palace moments always were. A brief flicker of the unpredictable inside a life designed to contain it. It had been contained. Just barely. By one step, precisely placed. The question that sat unspoken in the rooms of the palace that night was not whether the situation had been handled. It had been. The question was what it revealed about the edges where Camilla's private life and her institutional life intersected, about the people who moved in that overlap, about what it cost a family to live inside the glass dome of royal existence where even love arrived with a protocol attached. Nobody asked the question out loud. They didn't need to. It asked itself, in the silence between the things that were said and the things that were merely understood. The palace was very good at those kinds of questions. The kind that lived in the silence. The kind with no clean answer. 3 days passed before Camilla called her son. This was not avoidance, or not entirely. It was the rhythm of her life, which left very little unscheduled space, and also the deliberate pause of a woman who knew that certain conversations needed to settle before they could be had usefully. She had learned this over years of being on the wrong side of conversations that were had too quickly, in too much heat, before the feelings involved had been allowed to cool to something workable. Tom answered on the second ring. His voice was warm, easy, the same voice it always was. He asked how she was. She said fine and meant something more complicated by it, but let fine stand. They talked for a few minutes about ordinary things, a dinner he had been to, something she had read, the usual overlapping rhythms of a mother and son who love each other and have always had to build their relationship around the edges of extraordinary circumstances. Then, she said, quietly but without preamble, that she needed to talk to him about the morning at the palace. There was a pause. Not long. Tom Parker Bowles was not a man who deflected easily or pretended things hadn't happened. One of the things she loved about him was that he said that he'd been waiting for her to bring it up. She told him what the officer's step had meant. Not as criticism, she was careful, exact in her care. She told him the way she would tell anyone she loved something they needed to know but had not been positioned to understand on their own. She explained the logic of the protection, the non-negotiable nature of the protocol, the way that even the most well-intentioned movement in a room where a protected person was present required a kind of telegraphing, a slowness, a predictability that normal human enthusiasm did not naturally produce. She said that the officer had done exactly what he was trained to do and had done it well. She said that she did not think Tom had understood what that moment looked like from the officer's position, and from George's position, and from the position of everyone in the room who was responsible for what happened inside it. Tom was quiet for most of this. When he spoke, he said that he hadn't thought of it that way. That to him it had been, he searched for the right word, impulsive. He had just been happy to see the boy. He liked George. George was a good kid. She said she knew that. She said that was not the point. He heard her. She could tell because he stopped searching for qualifications and just said yes. He understood, he was sorry, he would be more careful. He said it simply, without the defensiveness that people often reach for when they feel they've been corrected about something they meant well. This was also one of the things she loved about him. After they hung up, Camilla sat for a moment with her phone in her hand. The conversation had gone better than she had worried it might. It had gone the way conversations go when both people in them have the same fundamental respect for each other even when the subject matter is difficult. She had not had to be harsh. She had not had to be anything other than honest and direct, which was her preference in all things when the situation allowed it. What she could not fully say to Tom, what she held back, not out of deception but out of the particular restraint of a mother who refuses to burden her children with the full weight of what she carries, was the larger thing. The thing underneath the incident. The way that morning had landed in her not just as a management problem or a protocol breach but as a reminder of the fault line she had lived on for 15 years. The fault line between who she was as Camilla Parker Bowles, a woman with a history and a family and a life that preceded the palace, and who she was as Queen Camilla, a figure who now existed inside an institution that had its own gravity, its own demands, its own lines that could not be crossed even by love. Her children belonged to the first version of her. The palace contained the second. And the morning had been the moment those two worlds collided in his sitting room and had to be separated by a man with his palm out. She did not say this to Tom because it would not have been useful and because she was not, ultimately, a woman who used her children as the audience for her interior landscape. But she thought it. She sat with it. She gave it the few minutes it deserved before she closed it away and moved on to the rest of the day. Elsewhere in the palace, William was having a conversation of his own. He had requested a briefing with his senior protection officer, not the officer from the morning, but the head of his family's overall security detail. The man came in, sat down, and spent 40 minutes walking William through the protocol framework in enough detail to satisfy a man who needed to understand systems rather than simply be reassured by their existence. William was that kind of man. He did not want to be told everything was fine. He wanted to know why everything was fine and what the mechanism was that made it so. The officer explained the morning's response in technical terms, the positioning, the threat assessment algorithm that every protection officer runs constantly in the background of every room, the way that rapid unannounced movement toward a protected person triggers a response regardless of who the mover is. He explained that the officer had not known who Tom Parker Bowles was in the sense that mattered for protection purposes, not because the officer had failed to do his homework, but because for protection purposes the identity of the approaching person is irrelevant until the movement is assessed. You assess the movement first. Then, you deal with the person. William listened to all of this with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered to him. He asked about the officer, was he recognized for his response or quietly noted or what? The answer was that internal commendations in these situations were handled through proper channels and that yes, the response had been recorded as exemplary. William said good. He said it in the tone of a man who meant it entirely. Then, he asked the question he had been building toward since the beginning of the briefing. He asked whether, in the officer's professional assessment, George had handled the situation appropriately. The officer understood what William was actually asking. He was not asking whether George had physically done the right thing, there had been nothing for George to do. He was asking whether his son had shown signs of distress, of being affected in ways that weren't visible on the surface, of carrying something from the morning that he shouldn't have to carry alone. The officer's assessment was careful. He said that the prince had appeared composed. He said that the prince had asked one question afterward, to his afternoon protection officer, that suggested he was processing the event with clarity rather than anxiety. He relayed, with appropriate discretion, the substance of what George had asked and what the officer had explained. He mentioned that George had concluded by noting that the man had just been trying to say hello. William looked at the wall for a moment. Then, he looked back at the officer and said, with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile, that sounded about right. The briefing ended. The officer left. William sat alone in the room for another few minutes, doing what he always did when he had received information that he needed to live with rather than act on. Sitting with it. letting it settle into whatever configuration it was going to take in the permanent landscape of things he worried about in the middle of the night. George. Always George. All three of his children, but George in particular, because George was the one who carried the specific weight, the weight that came with being first in line, with being the future, with being the face that the world would eventually look to in the same way it looked to William now, in the same way it had looked to Charles before that, in the same way it had looked to Elizabeth for 70 years before any of them were born. That weight was real. It was enormous. It could not be removed. It could only be managed, with attention and love and the constant, vigilant work of making sure the boy underneath the future king had enough room to remain a boy for as long as possible. The morning had not damaged that. William knew this. The morning had been small in the scheme of things. But the small things accumulated. They were the texture of the life, the things that added up over years into an understanding of what this existence demanded and what it cost. George, meanwhile, was at his lessons. He was working through a geography assignment that had nothing to do with palaces or protection officers or the complicated architecture of a life lived inside public expectation. He was thinking about rivers. Their paths, their sources, the way they were shaped by the land they moved through and also shaped the land in return. His tutor had been pleased by a question he'd asked, a question about whether a river ever chose its own direction or whether everything about its path was determined by the landscape it had been born into. The tutor had said that was a very interesting way to think about it. That geographers actually debated variations of exactly that question. George had said HM in the way he said HM when something was landing in a place that was not purely academic. Then, he had returned to his work. The tutor had not thought much more about the exchange. It was the kind of thing children said when they were bright and their minds were running on two tracks at once. It was only later, months later, when the tutor mentioned it to someone in the casual way you mention things that have stayed with you for reasons you can't entirely explain, that the exchange would seem like more than a passing remark from an 11-year-old in the middle of a geography lesson. A river and the land it was born into. Whether the path is chosen or given. Whether the shape of the thing is its own or the landscape's. The palace outside the classroom window was very old and very still. The guards were at their posts. The flowers in the east garden were still the freshly cut ones, or the next set of freshly cut ones. In the palace it was hard to tell, the replacement was so seamless. The world outside the gates was moving in its usual frantic London way, unaware of the conversations happening inside, unaware of the boy at his desk thinking about rivers, unaware of the woman in her private rooms who had just hung up the phone after a conversation with her son and was now composing herself for the next thing the day required of her. The fault lines were still there. They did not close. They never closed. They were the condition of the place. You learned to live over them, across them, with them. You learned to walk lightly and watch carefully and trust the people whose job it was to move when movement was required. The palace had been holding itself this way for centuries. It would hold itself this way for centuries more. Everyone inside it, the queen and her complicated family, the future king and his watchful father, the protection officers and the household staff and the tutors and the gardeners who kept cutting the flowers, all of them were just the latest set of people learning how to walk across the fault lines without falling in. Some days they managed it better than others. 3 days after the morning in the sitting room, they were managing. Imperfectly, humanly, with conversations that said some things and held other things back. But, managing. That, in the palace's economy, counted as a good few days. 2 weeks after the morning in the sitting room, something small happened that nobody planned and nobody could have arranged even if they had tried. Tom Parker Bowles attended a larger family gathering at the palace, a Sunday lunch that included several members of the extended royal family, their staff, and the comfortable, informal noise of a family meal that attempts, despite all evidence against it, to feel like a normal Sunday lunch. These gatherings happened periodically. They were important to the family in ways that were both genuine and deliberate, an insistence on the ordinary rhythms of family life as an anchor against the extraordinary pressure of everything else. George was there. He was always at these Sunday events when his schedule allowed, and it allowed that week. The two of them ended up near each other in the garden after the meal, in that particular post-lunch hour when adults drift into loose conversations and children exist in the spaces between them. Tom was talking to someone a few feet away. George was nearby, not quite part of the adult conversation and not quite removed from it. The natural gravitational drift of a gathering eventually brought them into proximity. Tom turned to the boy. And, this time he did it differently. He moved slowly. He extended his hand first, clearly, visibly, giving the gesture all the telegraphed intention it needed. He said hello to George with a warmth that was the same warmth he'd always had, but slower now, measured, respectful in a way that was entirely new. He said he thought George had handled himself very well the other morning, which was not the kind of thing adults usually said to children in the palace, because adults in the palace tended to protect children from the awareness that they had been handling anything at all. George looked at him for a moment, shook his hand with the steady handshake of a child who had been taught to shake hands and had been doing it since he was old enough to understand that it meant something. He said thank you. Then, he said, without any particular drama, that he knew Tom hadn't meant anything by it. Tom looked at the boy for a moment. Something moved through his expression, not quite surprise, because Tom was perceptive enough to have suspected that George was more aware than he appeared. But something adjacent to it. The particular thing that happens when a person is seen more clearly than they expected to be. He said that was very kind of George to say. George said he just thought it was worth saying. Then, he moved off towards something else that had caught his attention in the garden, with the natural ease of a child who has made his point and sees no reason to linger over it. Tom stood where he was for a moment, watching the boy walk away. Then, he went back to the adult conversation he'd been having, and the garden went on being a Sunday garden, and the lunch dissolved into the easy afterward of a family that, whatever else it was trying. Camilla had seen the exchange from across the garden. She had not arranged it and had not positioned herself to watch it. It had just happened in her line of sight, the way things happen at family gatherings when the space is not very large and the people in it are people you love and therefore tend to track without meaning to. She watched her son shake the boy's hand. She watched George speak. She watched Tom's face when the boy said what he said. She did not know exactly what George had said, but she understood the tone of it, the posture of it, the way Tom's expression had shifted. She turned back to the conversation she was having and said nothing about what she'd just seen. She filed it in the same place she filed the things she observed about the people she loved deeply, permanently, with care. Later, much later, she would describe the moment to a close friend as the kind of thing that made her understand, all over again, that the children of this family were not simply being raised inside it. They were being shaped by it into something that the rest of the world would not fully be able to see until much later, when the shape revealed itself completely. George, she said, had the particular quality of a person who understood the difference between forgiving someone and excusing them. He had forgiven his grandmother's son for making him the center of an alarming moment. He had not excused it by pretending it hadn't happened. He had acknowledged it directly and then placed it in its right category, not a threat, not a grievance, just a thing that had happened and was now over. At 11 years old. Her friend had said that was remarkable. Camilla had said quietly that she was not particularly surprised. Inside the palace, the week following the Sunday lunch saw a gradual settling. The report in the official record remained where it was. These things were never removed, only contextualized by whatever came after them. The protection officer who had made the step received a quiet, formal acknowledgement through the right channels, the kind that carries no ceremony but carries weight precisely because of its understatement. He did not discuss it publicly or with colleagues beyond what was required. He went back to his position. He stood at his posts. He did what he had always done, which was to hold the perimeter of a life that could not be unguarded. William had moved through the 2 weeks with the particular focus of a man who had decided that the right response to the morning was to intensify something he was already doing rather than create something new. He spent more time with George, not dramatically, not in a way that George would have flagged as different. Just present. More present. Watching the boy with the particular attention of a father who understands that what he is watching is not just a child growing up but a child growing into a role, and who wants, with everything in him, to make sure the role does not come at the cost of the child. They had kicked a football in the garden one afternoon, the two of them, just the two of them. George had scored twice, which William contested energetically and George had found enormously satisfying. For 40 minutes they had been just a father and son in a garden, which was an ordinary thing and, also, given who they were, an act of conscious preservation. Catherine had spoken to George. She had done it in her way, which was to let the conversation find its own moment rather than scheduling it. She had been helping him with something unrelated, a project he was working on, and the conversation had naturally arrived at the morning in the way conversations arrive at things when there is time and ease and no pressure. She had asked simply how he'd felt in that moment. George had thought about it seriously. He had said that he'd felt alert. Like when you're in a test and you're not sure of the answer but you concentrate really hard anyway. Catherine had said that was a very interesting way to describe it. She had not told him it was mature or impressive or any of the things that adults tell children when they say something that surprises them with its insight, because she knew that he received those compliments with the slight wariness of a child who has learned that praise can be a form of distance. Instead, she had just said it was a good description, and moved on to the project they were working on. He had, at some point near the end of the afternoon, looked up from what he was doing and asked whether the officer had been in trouble. Catherine had said no. That the officer had done exactly what he was supposed to do, and that doing what you're supposed to do is never the thing that gets you in trouble. George had said good. In the same tone he'd used in the garden with Tom, direct, settled, no drama around the edges of it. Then, he'd gone back to his work. The thing about living inside an enormous institution is that it moves whether you want it to or not. Events are scheduled. Calendars are filled. The country has expectations. The public has appearances it wants and occasions it marks and ceremonies it expects to see the family present for, upright and ceremonious and performing the specific kind of continuity that monarchies are built on, the message that things persist, that tradition holds, that the line goes on. All of it requiring the people inside it to show up and represent something larger than themselves, repeatedly, regardless of what the previous 2 weeks had contained. George showed up. He always showed up. He stood where he was supposed to stand at the engagement that followed that Sunday lunch. He wore what he was supposed to wear. His face was arranged in the appropriate way. A photographer on a ladder caught an image that would be widely shared, the young prince, composed and clear-eyed, looking directly into the camera with an expression that people would project onto in various ways. Some would say he looked serious. Some would say he looked confident. Some would see something in his eyes that they couldn't quite name and would write about it in the comments sections of royal news sites in the uncertain language of people trying to articulate something they recognize but cannot define. What they were seeing, without knowing what they were seeing, was the boy coming into his own. Not dramatically. Not in a single moment. But, the way it actually happens, gradually, through accumulation, through the small events that nobody outside witnesses but that build, layer by layer, the architecture of the person who will eventually step fully into the frame. A morning in a sitting room. A man who moved too fast and was stopped. A boy who stood still. Questions asked and answered. A geography lesson about rivers. A garden in the afternoon. A handshake that went differently than the last one. None of it individually was the story. All of it together was. The palace had been stunned. It had been stunned the way old institutions are stunned, not by what happened but by the reminder that even within the most carefully controlled environments, the human element persists. People love each other imperfectly. They move toward each other without thinking. They carry their histories into rooms where history is supposed to stay outside. And, sometimes those movements require a correction. A step. A line drawn quietly but clearly. The institution absorbed the correction and continued. The family absorbed it and continued. The boy absorbed it and continued, which was the most important of the three and the one that required the most. The institution was old and had seen everything. The family was practiced at endurance. The boy was 11 and still in the process of becoming. He was becoming something, though. Something that the morning had added to, in its small, sharp, unscheduled way. Something that the conversation with Tom in the garden had added to. Something that the football match with his father and the quiet afternoon with his mother and the 100 other unseen moments of this life were building, brick by careful brick, in the space between the public version of him and the private one. somewhere between those two versions was the actual person. The one who asked whether rivers chose their paths. The one who said things worth saying and didn't linger over them. The one who stood still when the room around him moved unexpectedly, and watched, and understood more than he showed. The future king was not made in the ceremonies and the photographs and the balcony appearances. He was being made right now, in the ordinary and extraordinary texture of a life that was both impossibly constrained and, somehow, still being lived with something that looked, from a certain angle, like freedom. The freedom of a boy who had learned that composure was not suppression and that watching was not passivity and that standing still, at the right moment, could be its own kind of power. The guard had taken one step. Precise. Necessary. Already, by the world outside those walls, entirely forgotten. Inside them, it had done more than stop a man mid-stride. It had been one of the moments. One of the small accumulating moments from which everything larger, eventually, comes. The kind that only makes sense in retrospect, when you look back from whatever the future holds and trace the path that led there, the way a river's path makes sense when you look at it from above, when you can see both where it began and where it went, and understand, finally, that both the landscape and the water had a hand in shaping it. George would grow up. The throne would wait, as it always had, with the immense patience of something that has been waiting for centuries and has no urgency about waiting a few more years. The palace would stand. The guards would stand. The freshly cut flowers in the East Garden would keep being replaced by the next set of freshly cut flowers in the seamless way that palaces maintained their surfaces. And, one morning in his sitting room would remain exactly what it was one morning. One step. One boy, standing still, watching, building his map. Ready, in ways even he did not fully know yet, for whatever came next.